Today I'm working with ON1 PHOTO RAW 2022. I want to take a look at the texture filter. To me, it can be a little confusing. And so today I want to kind of demystify it for you. This is called Understanding the Texture Filter. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to the Joy of Editing with Dave Kelly. Today I'm working with ON1 PHOTO RAW. Now, I really love working with textures, and ON1 has a really good texture filter inside of it. I wanted to really demystify it because to me it can be a little bit confusing, and it was to me, so I want to clear some things up about it today, and hopefully by the end of this tutorial you'll have a much better understanding of how to use this filter. I went to ON1's online user's guide to see if I could get some help, and this is the information you get on the textures filter. Now, as I read through it, I thought, well, this doesn't really help me all that much, so I decided to really dig into it myself. Once I wrapped my head around this filter, I wanted to share it with you, and that's what this video is all about. If you don't yet own ON1 PHOTO RAW 2022.5, I'll give you a link in the description below this video. Click on that. That'll take you to the ON1 site where you can purchase it or download a free trial. If you decide you want to purchase it, use my promo code David Kelly at checkout. You'll receive 20% off your purchase, which is a nice savings. I make a small commission and it helps me to keep these YouTube tutorials coming your way. Let's go ahead and jump into this. Now, I'm just using a stock image today, and this is not about me making a beautiful little image for you with a texture. It's about how the texture filter actually works. I want to really get into the nitty-gritty of it and demystify it for you. I really love adding textures to images. I think it gives them a nice artistic look. It takes maybe just an average photograph and can turn it into something nice. If you like to work with textures, or if you'd like to learn how to work with textures, let me know in the comments section below. I'd really love to hear from you. Let's go ahead and add a texture filter. All we need to do is come to Effects, click on Effects, and click Add Filter. And you're going to find Texture right here. Click on that, and we add a texture filter, and already we can see we have a texture applied to our image. Now you'll notice we have an opacity slider up at the top, which we can adjust how much of that effect is being applied to the overall image by adjusting it. Okay, I'm going to leave it up full for now, and then we have here some presets, and if you click right here where it says more, you're going to see a whole bunch more presets in here. And it's really nice when you hover over these, you'll see how that preset will look on your image, which is really kind of cool. And then if we come over to the bottom left-hand side and click this icon right here, we're going to show our presets and filters pane. Now, right now you're seeing all of the different presets that you have, and you can see presets is in dark here. And if you click on this gray filters, if you click this, you're going to see all the presets for the filter that you're on. So that could be a little confusing. They're all presets. So in other words, if I click on presets, you're seeing different presets. In other words, you'll see some black and white presets, you'll see some color type presets, different presets. But then when you click filters, you're going to see whichever filter you have applied over here, you're going to see thumbnails for the presets of that particular filter. And then if you click this icon here, you're going to see those thumbnails larger. And this is a good way to look at the different effects you can get with a particular filter. In this case, we're looking at a texture filter. If you've never worked with textures before, this is a good starting point for you, just to give you an idea of what direction that you may want to go in. So take advantage of this. I don't generally use this too often, so I'm going to go ahead and close it out. And I'll also close this pane back up. And now we're going to concentrate on the filter itself. Let's take a look at the import button. If you click on it, you'll notice that you can import your own textures, which is really nice. I'm not getting into this today, but know that you can import your own textures if you want. And then we have a category. This category is called walls. If you click right here, it's a drop down. You have different categories. Like you'll notice you have fabric, metal, monochrome, natural, different categories in here. You may have more or less than I do, depending if you've purchased textures from ON1 or if you purchased textures from other sources or made your own textures. And then you also have the actual texture itself. Right now, this texture is called Blue Fence. And if I click this drop down, you can see all the different textures inside of this group called Walls. We have all these textures in here that we can work with. And you'll notice we have an opacity slider here. and it's defaulted at 80. This opacity slider is different than this one up here, and I'll explain that to you here. And this is where some of the confusion comes in. And it all centers around, my biggest confusion centers around this mode here. And this mode, as far as I'm concerned, is unique to ON1 Photo RAW. And it's really nice, but it's confusing. They don't really explain it. At least I haven't found where they explain it. But you'll notice when I click the drop down, we have 5 modes. We have normal. I'll hover over it and you can see what it looks like. Here's normal, here's subtle, here's lighter, here's darker, and here is replace. Let's start out with replace. I'll click on replace, and you'll notice if I drag it to the left, I'm only affecting the texture. I'm removing the texture more and more as I drag this to the left till I don't see any of the texture. And if I drag it the whole way over to the right, all you see is texture, which is different from this opacity. This opacity is the overall effect of the filter over the entire image. Now, right now, when I'm in the normal blend mode, which I am, and I'll show you, if I click this little gear icon, you'll notice it says I'm in the normal blend mode. When you're in the normal blend mode, this opacity slider will act just like the one below it. If I drag it to the left, I'll remove that filter effect till it's totally gone. Now, this second opacity slider is only for the opacity of the actual texture itself. And as I said, in the normal blend mode, these two act the same. But when you're in the replace mode and you change the blend mode up here, this opacity slider will act differently. And I'll show you what I mean in a second, but just understand one thing. You see here this mode replace. When this texture filter is in the replace mode, this texturizing filter works just like Photoshop would work when you're working with textures and blend modes, and I'll show you what I mean. Now, I will get into the other modes here, which are something special that only ON1 that I know of has in its texture filter. So if you want to work like you normally would work with textures, if you're used to working with textures, I would recommend that you use the replace mode and use blend modes, okay? So let's come up to the gear icon. Right now we're in the replace mode with the opacity of the texture up to 100%. If we change our blend mode to, say, a typical blend mode that a lot of folks like to use for texturing, and one of those blend modes would be, say, like the multiply blend mode. That's what the multiply blend mode would look like. Now you can take the opacity amount here and pull it back, okay? And remove some of that texture off of there, or the overall effect, I should say. Now, if I come to the opacity here and take this opacity back, it's going to take the opacity back of the texture, but you notice how the image still looks dark. As opposed to if I take this opacity and take it the whole way back, the image doesn't look dark. And the reason being is when we're in the replace mode here and I pull the opacity back, I'm only dealing with the actual texture itself. But I am still in the multiply blend mode. If I change this multiply blend mode back to normal, now it looks right, okay? So let's go back to multiply and let's take our texture opacity and pull it the whole way up. But that's one of the popular texture modes. Blend modes, multiply. Another one would be screen, which is right here. It doesn't look so good in this image. Another one would be overlay, and remember these, and another one would be soft light. So soft light, overlay, screen, and multiply are your typical blend modes for texturing, all right? And now let's go back up here to normal. Now, like I said, if you're used to working with textures, I recommend you use this replace mode and change your blend modes up here at the top. You have to open up the gear icon and then just click right here, and there's all the different blend modes that you can hover through and see how they affect your image. So for a seasoned texture artist out there, I recommend replace and change blend modes. If you're new to texturing and you want to get into the ON1 way of texturing, I would recommend using these modes down here. Right now we're in replace, but it's very important that you leave this mode in normal. I would highly recommend, if you're going to use these modes down here, other than replace you can use the other blend modes. But when you're using any of these modes other than replace, you want to always keep this in normal. That's very important. Don't forget that step. Now we can go ahead and close these blending options by clicking the gear icon. And now let's get into what I'm going to call the ON1 way of texturing, and that's using this mode button. But remember, you want to keep the blending option up here as normal, the normal blend mode, okay? So let me close that again. Just want to really point that out to you. So we're going to use these modes down here. Right now we're in replace. I'm going to go out of replace and let's go to normal. Now normal is our first option. Normal is the same as the overlay blend mode. I guarantee you that 100%. And remember, I told you there's 4 top blend modes for texturing, and that's overlay, soft light, screen, and multiply. Normal is overlay, subtle is soft light, lighter is, can you guess, screen, and darker is, can you guess that one, multiply. So there are your 4 top blend modes. And that's all they are. Normal, which is overlay, subtle, which is soft light. I wish they would have just named them like that. It would have been less confusing. Lighter is screen, and darker is multiply. But I guess they want to use different language here, especially if you're new to texturing and you're just a user of ON1. But for people that are seasoned texture artists out there, this would be a little bit confusing to them. It took me a while to wrap my head around this. Something we typically do when we're texturing images is work with opacity. Now remember, this opacity slider up here is for the overall opacity of the image. So if I wanted to get a better look, I might feel this is too strong at 100%. I may pull it back to around like 50% and say, you know what, that looks better. But let's go ahead and take it back to 100%. This other opacity slider, when you're in the normal blend mode and you're using these modes down here, now don't get confused. This normal is not a normal blend mode. This is the same as an overlay blend mode. When I take this opacity slider back, it acts just like this opacity slider. Check this out. It's taking the texture off, but it's not affecting the blend mode whatsoever. It's acting like that top opacity slider, so don't be fooled and don't be confused. It is kind of confusing, to be honest with you. But if you want to use the basic ON1 method of texturizing, always leave this again in the normal blend mode and then use these different modes for your 4 favorite blend modes, which are overlay, soft light, screen, and multiply. Again, I wish they would have called them that blend mode. It would have made it so much easier. Now let me go down to replace and click on replace. Now you can also use replace if you just do not want to use a blend mode, but you just want to have the texture, and you can either use this opacity slider or this one, it doesn't matter. Pull it back and just apply a little bit of that texturing. Now it doesn't apply a blend mode, so there's no blending effect there. You're just in the replace mode. It's just the raw texture blending in with the image, and sometimes that can look really nice. But let me go ahead and take this the whole way back up again. And remember, the replace is also good if you want to work traditionally with textures. Leave this in replace and then come up to the gear icon and change your blend modes here. And you'll work like you would in a typical program, say like Photoshop. But for now, I'm going to leave that on normal. And we're just going to be working with the modes here. Remember, these are not blend modes. These are modes. It is confusing. So let's go out of replace and let's go to, I think, darker. I like darker. And now remember, darker is the same as the multiply blend mode. They're just calling it darker. Now we can take the opacity and we can pull it back. It doesn't matter if I use this opacity or this opacity, we're going to get the same effect. So let's just take that back a little bit. And now the image looks a little on the dark side. Now when I adjust this brightness control, we have a section here called tone and color. This brightness deals only with the texture itself. So when I drag this adjustment to the right, you'll notice it is making the texture lighter. If I take it the whole way to the left, my image doesn't go to total blackness, right? Because I'm only dealing with the texture itself. So I'm adjusting the brightness of the texture, and it's working in conjunction with the blend mode. So I can lighten up that texture and it'll look like this. If that texture has some saturation to it, and this is called blue wall, so there's a lot of blue in here. And watch the image when I drag the saturation to the right. See how it gets more blue? Because there's a lot of blue in that texture. Or I could take some of that blue off, or take it the whole way off, and now that texture becomes a black and white texture. Now we also have this Hue Shift. Let me pull up that texture, or let me pull up the saturation, I should say. And now we can shift the hue of that blue. So we have a lot of flexibility here that we can work with. If you double click these circles, you can reset it back. Let me double click this, and that sets it back to 0. So I have the actual amount of saturation that the texture has on it. I haven't increased it or decreased it. Now we also have an invert. So if we click invert, we're only going to invert the texture. So right now you see these dark lines of the texture here in the blue wall. If I click invert, they become light. Okay, and let's increase the opacity so we can really see this, how it's working. Here you go. Here it is inverted. Now let me invert it back to normal, and it looks like that. So we do have this invert. And don't forget this, because sometimes doing an inversion of a texture can really make it look really interesting. So don't forget about that. You have all these options and you have to play with them. And that's the important part of texturing. You do have to play. But for now, I'm going to pull this opacity back again, maybe somewhere around here. And let's keep on going down here. Now this saturation here, if I take it the whole way off, I've removed the saturation off the texture. And then we have this button here called Colorize. Let's turn on Colorize and watch what happens. My image goes red, right? Because my amount is up to 100%. But we can add colorization to the texture. Say if it is a black and white texture, or you had a texture that you didn't like the color on it, you could pull the saturation off like I just did, and then add your own color to it. Okay, so that's too strong. So let me pull this back to maybe around here, but then I could take this hue fill and shift it into different hues and find something that looks more pleasing to my eye, and maybe something around there. And let me add a little bit more of the amount. That's probably too much, and I don't really like that. I'm going to warm it a little bit more, maybe right around here, and go see that extra warmth that goes in there. So you have all these different adjustments that you can work with and play around with. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and double click this and reset it, and double click this and reset it, and shut off Colorize. And let me put the saturation back to default by double clicking this. Now, if this saturation's up and you add colorization to it, these two will still interact with each other, so that's important. If you don't want the original saturation to interact with it, just pull it off. And now we have a scale right here. But before I get into the scale, let's go to this button right here, Fit to Canvas. I recommend that you leave this on, and it is on by default. If this is checked on, and it'll be blue when it is, that means whenever you have a texture, and you may have your own textures, and they may be smaller than the image that you're working on, if you click on Fit to Canvas, they'll always be the same size as your canvas. So that's kind of important. And now we come to the scale. What's the texture of the image when I start to take this scale and start to move it to the right? See how it gets larger? So we can scale that texture here. So that's nice. There's a lot of nice options here in the ON1 texture filter. It's one of the best ones on the market, to be honest with you. And then we also have this button here where we can rotate the texture 90 degrees clockwise. Every time you click it, you go 90 degrees. So here's one click. Rotates, here's another click, rotates again, here's another click, and one more. So you can rotate 90 degrees clockwise at a time. You can flip the texture vertically by clicking here. You can flip it horizontally by clicking this one. So you have all kind of adjustments. Now you know how this texture filter works, so I want you to get out there and try it. But let me go ahead and change this up real quick. Let me click on Postcard. And yeah, that looks pretty cool right there. And right now I'm in the darker blend mode, which is actually multiply. But let's try a different blend mode. Here is overlay, which is normal. Here is soft light, which is subtle. And here is screen. So I do like the darker. So let me click on darker. Let me take the opacity and take it the whole way up. I think that looks really good. And let's work with the brightness of it. I think I'll darken it up a little bit. Now remember, that's just darkening up the texture. And as far as the color, it's a little too yellow, so I'm going to take the saturation back a little bit. I don't mind a little bit of that warmth in there. And remember, I can shift that hue a little bit one way or the other. And I might just do that right about there. Now let's play with this saturation right there. Now remember also, you do have, for instance, your layer masking. So I could click on layer masks right here and I could paint it off the bird if I wanted to. And then you could add multiple textures. You can add another texture on top of this one and then another one. But the key with texturing is experimentation, layer masking, working with all these different controls. It's a lot of fun. If you'd like to see another video where I actually do an artistic texturing on an image, let me know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this tutorial today, please give it a like and share it with your friends. And if you're not yet a subscriber to my channel, please subscribe, click that bell notification icon, and then every time I upload a new tutorial, you'll be notified about it. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining me today in the Joy of Editing with Dave Kelly. I'll see you all right here next time, but until then, happy editing.